My name's John, a Christadelphian that lives in Crewe. I go to the Christadelphian church there on Edleston Road. We planned to do a public event on April the 7th, it's Tuesday, where we were going to invite people into our lovely meeting room, into our church. We wanted to do a presentation about some of the things that we believe, and really just treat it as an opportunity to invite people in and for you to get to know us a little bit. I think for those people who live in Crewe, a lot of people are familiar with seeing the room, the hall there, and perhaps wonder what's going on. And so it would have been a good opportunity to tell a little bit about what we believe and who we are. Now, as many people have been saying, we live, don't we, in unprecedented times with the coronavirus and all that's happening around the world, and the kind of deprivation of freedom that it's bringing on all of us, that we can't go out, and that's the same for us in our meeting meeting room, our church in Crewe. We're not able to meet there at the moment, and so what we thought we'd do was to do a brief presentation on a very topical subject, just so that we still carried on with this opportunity of telling our neighbours just a little bit about what we believe. My name's John, as I said at the beginning, and I attend this church, this meeting room, a couple of times a week. Live in Crewe with my wife and two children. And the subject I've been thinking about is, how can the Bible help us in these unprecedented times? You know, if ever there was a time we think when we'd look to a faith that can help make sense of things, then how can the Bible help us in these days? And I just want to spend a few minutes talking through some of my thoughts about this subject, how the Bible can help us in these unprecedented times. When I've been thinking about it, I think what it tells me is that God is in control, even if things don't make sense to me. You know, so that when I look at all the turmoil that's happening in the world and the uncertainty, so for us here in the UK, we don't know quite how long this is going to last. For those people with children at home who don't know how long the schools are going to be closed for those in frontline staff, they don't know how long the peak is going to last for. There's a great deal of uncertainty, and I think with my faith in the Bible, how the Bible helps me in these times is it says that even though things might seem so to me, that nonetheless that God is in control. I'd like to share some Bible passages with you that they give me some comfort in times like this. And the first one that I'm turning to is in the book of Acts, and Acts chapter 1. When we turn to the book of Acts in chapter 1, what we find is a promise that Jesus made when he was speaking to his disciples. So this is after he's been crucified and raised from the dead, and he's about to say goodbye to his disciples. And he made a promise to them that he would be coming back to the earth. Now, I'm just going to read you from Acts chapter 1, verses 9 through to 11. It goes like this. Now, when Jesus had spoken these things, while the disciples watched, he was taken up, and a cloud received him out of their sight. And while they looked steadfastly toward heaven as he went up, behold, two men stood by them in white apparel, who also said, Men of Galilee, why do you stand gazing up into heaven? This same Jesus, who was taken up from you into heaven, will so come in like manner as you saw him go into heaven. So this is Jesus then promising his disciples, the disciples then and the disciples of all ages, that he's going to come back. And this then is what the Bible teaches has been an integral part of God's plan that he's got with the world, that Jesus came the first time as a baby Jesus in the manger, and the Jesus, though, he's coming back again the second time, but this time as a king. To take you to another passage, also in the Acts of the Apostles, in Acts chapter 17, this is where the Apostle Paul is speaking in the city of Athens, and he has this to say. So Acts chapter 17 and verse 30. He says, Truly these times of ignorance God overlooked, but now commands all men everywhere to repent, because he has appointed a day on which he will judge the world in righteousness by the man whom he has ordained. And this is Jesus. He's given assurance of this to all by raising him from the dead. So this is, just from taking a couple of passages from our Bibles here, this is God's master plan then, is to send Jesus back to the earth and for him to be God's judge, God's appointed judge, and for him then to be the world ruler, ruling over a world that God intended in the beginning. So this is God's plan, and this is what the Bible teaches us. And I reach for passages like this to remind me that certainly what the Bible preaches is that God is in control and he does have a plan. And so the question, I guess, would be, well, when are these things going to happen? And it's exactly the same question that Jesus' disciples asked all those years ago. I'm now turning to Luke chapter 21. And if you happen to be looking in your Bibles, that's great. I'm actually going to be staying in Luke chapter 21 for the rest of this podcast now. And this chapter is all about Jesus talking to his disciples just before his crucifixion, just before his arrest and his crucifixion, and he's trying to prepare them for what's going to happen. And their question then is the same, is to say, well, God's master plan is that you're going to be set up as a mighty king. When's that going to happen? And we read of this in Luke chapter 21 and verse 7. So they asked Jesus, saying, Teacher, but when will these things be? And what sign will there be when these things are about to take place? You see, they're asking the question that beyond a very reasonable question to ask, wouldn't it? To say, well, when's all this going to happen? And well, Jesus' answer is really interesting because part of Jesus' answer is that before he comes back, there's going to be things that would be signs that he was about to come back. And the signs, well, let's have a look at them. It's in verse 9 through to 11 in this chapter. He says, but when you hear of wars and commotions, do not be terrified, for these things must come to pass first, but the end will not come immediately. Then he said to them, nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be great earthquakes in various places, and famines and pestilences, and there will be fearful sights and great signs from heaven. So when the disciples then asked Jesus, well, when is it you're going to come back? His answer is, well, you need to look out for certain signs. And when you see these signs, it means that I'm on my way. And included in those signs were, well, wars and earthquakes and, interestingly, pestilences or diseases or epidemics or pandemics, which is exactly what we're seeing now. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that this particular pandemic is saying that Jesus is about to return. I'm simply saying that it's one of the things that we should be looking out for if we're looking to see when it is Jesus is going to come back. It might be as a result of, it might be that he's coming back right now, it might be there's many years still to come. But nonetheless, the fact that we see a pandemic is something that, horrible as though it is that we're meant to notice and say, we are meant to expect these things like wars and famines and so on. We're meant to expect these things. They're not an aberration. They're not a departure from God's plan. But this is to be expected. Sadly, in fact, when you think about the way people are worried, me included, really, if I'm honest, about what's happening, Jesus told his disciples that this was something to expect as well. That people would be worried about what's happening next. I'm a little later in chapter 21 now. I'm now looking down in verse 25, where we read, there will be signs in the sun, in the moon, and in the stars, and on the earth distress of nations with perplexity, the sea and the waves roaring, men's hearts failing them from fear and the expectation of those things which are coming on the earth, for the powers of the heavens will be shaken. I find this really telling because, well, men's and women's hearts are failing them from fear, aren't they? Are desperately worried. And people will rightly say, well, what is the world coming to? And here we've got Jesus saying, well, do you know what? When people are saying those kind of things, then actually get ready, because these are the kind of things, there are signs that I'll be coming back soon. And he carries on to say that after you've seen these things, so wars and people being very worried, verse 27 then says, then they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. So these things are precedents. Then these things are things that come before Jesus returns. And he said that when things like this happen, when we see wars, when we see famines, and when we see pandemics like the one that we see around us today, then actually we should try, as hard as it might be, but we should try and be positive, because it could mean that he is about to return. He says this in the next verse. He says, now, when these things begin to happen, look up and lift up your heads, because your redemption draws near. So what are we saying? Well, we're saying that answering the question, how can the Bible help us in unprecedented times like these? And what I'm saying here is that, well, the Bible tells me that God's in control, even if things don't quite make sense to me. And that God's plan is that Jesus will return to the earth again. And there are certain signs we need to look out for just prior to his return. And this pandemic then is one of the signs. Yeah, so pestilence is one of the signs that we need to be looking for. Now God has given us plenty of testament, of encouragement that he keeps his promises. So in our Bibles, I've got my Bible here, in our Bibles, God makes lots of promises, and he gives us comfort that we can trust him to keep his promises. And one of them is this, that Jesus said in this same conversation he has with the disciples, he said that Jerusalem was going to be destroyed. Now, this is back in verse 20 of this same chapter. I'll read it to you. Jesus says, but when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation is near. He goes on to spell it out really clearly that Jerusalem was going to be destroyed. And sure enough, this happened 40 years or so after Jesus was put to death. This happened in AD 70. And furthermore, Jesus went on to say that from that point, people who lived in Jerusalem, the Jews who lived in Jerusalem, that they would be scattered throughout the whole world. And verse 24 is where he says this. He says, they will fall by the edge of the sword and be led away captive into all nations. And indeed, there have been. You find the Jews all over the world. But he went on to say that they'd come back. They'd come back to Jerusalem. He says, Jerusalem will be trampled by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. Now, Gentiles here are people who are not Jews. So it's simply saying that Jerusalem will be controlled by non-Jews until their time has come to an end, and then it will be taken back and it will be controlled by Jews again. And this happened. This happened in 1948 when the state of Israel was proclaimed, and then arguably also in 1967 where the Jews took the whole of the city. Don't get me wrong, I'm not a Zionist myself, but simply seeing it as part of the comfort, the evidence that God keeps his promises. That's about all I wanted to say, really. So I'd just like to wrap up here with a little bit of a summary of what it is that we've been talking about here. This, which is, how can the Bible help us in these unprecedented times? And my point was here, as you can see, that the Bible tells me that God is in control, even if things don't make sense to me. And I gave you these 3 points to think about. The God's promise that Jesus will come back to the earth as king, that he's told us to expect pandemics before that happens, and that the existence of the state of Israel shows that God keeps his promises. So that's just my thoughts on the topic. I won't claim to be an expert. Simply someone who loves his Bible, likes to study it, and I do kind of try and do my best to live by its commands and its principles. Those are my thoughts, and I hope those have been helpful. Thank you.